What's up, students? I'm so excited to be with you guys tonight. If we haven't had the chance to meet before, guess what? You're my new bestie. My name is Joy. I get the privilege of being one of our student pastors at our Gardens location. And over the past few weeks, we've been in a series called Make It Make Sense, where we've been looking at the Sermon on the Mount, the sermon that Jesus taught to his people. And we've been looking at some of those statements that feel so confusing. These statements that feel like they just don't make sense. See, on one week we talked about judging. What does it look like to judge? Should we judge? How do we judge? The next week we talked about what it looks like to be salty. And some of you are like, Joy, what are you talking about? That means you need to go back and watch those videos because it was so good. See, over the past few weeks we've been figuring out how to make sense of some things that feel like they don't. And tonight is no different. Tonight we're going to talk about what it looks like to love our enemies. And right now I want you to take a second in the chat, write down what you think an enemy is. What's the first thing that comes to mind? You might be thinking of that guy Thanos from Marvel, if you're a Marvel person, or if you're one of the three people who like DC more than Marvel, you might be thinking of the Joker. Or maybe if you're like, I'm not a superhero kind of person, you might be thinking of that dude with no nose from Harry Potter, Voldemort. No, you're not supposed to say his name, but I did. Whatever enemy you're thinking of, hate to break it to you, I'm not going to teach you what it looks like to love a supervillain. I'm going to teach you what it looks like to love your enemy, your real enemy, the person who spread a rumor about you that now you can't even be in the same room. What does it look like to love your bully who's been bullying you since the 3rd grade? What does it look like to love your real life enemies? Because we have them. And the statement that Jesus shares in Matthew feels like it shouldn't make sense. It says in Matthew 5:43 and 44, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I, Jesus, tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It just doesn't make sense. We've been told our whole life, if they don't agree with you, they're not your friend, cut them off. We've been told what it looks like to live in a cancel culture society. But here, Jesus is saying, I know what you've been told. I know what you have grown up hearing. I know cancel culture exists, but I tell you to love your enemy. I tell you to pray for the same person who persecutes you. It doesn't make sense. And so tonight we're going to be breaking down how we can make a statement like that make sense in our lives. And when we do this, we need to start asking ourselves some questions. And the first question should be, why? And you might be sitting there wondering, okay, Pastor Joy, why? Why should I love my enemy? Just because it says it in the Bible? And as your friend, as your new bestie, I would love to give you this like crazy answer that blows your mind. But the answer is simple. Jesus says to. Period. We look back at that scripture and it says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, period. It doesn't say, love your enemies sometimes. Pray for those who persecute you if you get something from them. No, it says love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. There's no gray area. He was clear. But some of you might be sitting there thinking, great. It's like when I ask my parents, hey, can I go to this thing? And they say no. And you always ask, well, why? And has your parent ever said, because I said so? And it makes you so angry and so annoyed because you just want to know why they said no. Well, tonight I'm not going to leave you on a because Jesus said so. Yes, Jesus said so, and that should be enough, but if it isn't, let me tell you why you should love your enemy. Because we were once enemies to Christ. We have once sinned against Christ, and before Jesus ever came into the picture, we would never be able to be with God. But because of Jesus, because of his love, we are able to be in relationship with him. That is why we should love our enemy. And the next question we should be asking ourselves is, well, when am I supposed to love my enemy? Well, it says in Romans 5:8, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. If you're wondering when, the answer is, while they were sinners. You love your enemies in the midst of their struggle, in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your offense, you love your enemy. And it feels like it doesn't make sense. And it feels like it's really hard. But when you're wondering when I should love my enemy, the answer is always. You should always be loving your enemy because Christ always loves your enemy. Who are we to disown or cancel somebody that Jesus said was their child? Who are we? The answer is, when we're figuring out when I should love, the answer is always, because Jesus always loved us. Jesus always forgave us. And the next question you might be sitting there wondering is, okay, I understand why. And I understand that I should love them always, but I just don't know how. How do we do it? And really, I think of the story of the servant who got forgiven of his debts. He owed a lot to this guy who was in a big, powerful position. And that king, that ruler said, you know what? I forgive you. Go forward. Keep living your life. And that same man went to somebody else who owed him money and said, give it. Give me all you got. And instead of forgiving, instead of showing grace, he went straight back to being selfish. And what happens is sometimes we let our offense dictate the way we live. We think, okay, you can forgive me. I want all the forgiveness, but I'm not going to give it out. The truth is, if we're wondering how, the first step should be to show people the grace that God's already shown us, to forgive people the same way God has already forgiven us. If you're wondering how, the first step is to forgive. And you might be wondering why. It's because forgiveness makes sense. It does. The story may not make sense. It may not make sense that Jesus forgave us, but forgiveness makes sense because it sets us free. We spend so much time stuck in unforgiveness and bitterness and hurt and pain when really Jesus has called us to love, because love is what brings freedom. Love is what brings joy and peace and kindness. Love is what really matters. So tonight, make it make sense in your life. I want you right now, wherever you are, to write down one name of somebody that it's time to forgive. And your first step of how is to pray and ask God to give you the wisdom and give you the words to say to forgive that person. Ask the Lord to give you the love for that person that's really hard right now. Because when we do this, that's our first how. That's how we can make it make sense in our life. Because I told you at the beginning, you want to know why you should love your enemy? Because Jesus said to. So knowing that, we can't stay where we were. We have to move forward.